Information Risk with David Loshin, powered by InsightJam.
I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and welcome back to another Information Risk podcast with our esteemed co-host, David Loshin, the principal analyst at Knowledge Integrity, and also a Solutions Review expert in all things data governance, data management. David, thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thanks. I'm very happy that we're continuing to get these things nailed down. We got 12 episodes under our belt, I think, and this is number 13. So lucky number 13.
Right on. Well, lucky is not the topic today because I want to talk about something that we were sharing back and forth, which was the cyber. It was an arson attack of coordinated sabotage in Paris just prior to the Olympics, where it was clearly aimed at kind of dragging down the larger transportation network, high-speed transportation network in France, as a way to cause disruption and chaos in and around Paris right before the Olympics. And it's interesting because it was a fairly analog attack. I think it was arson primarily, but it was arson in a very coordinated manner against digital elements, junction boxes and cables and so forth. And it does speak to the idea of, one way to cripple a modern society is to go after the transportation networks. And while transportation feels very analog, big, large steel elements moving about in a very three-dimensional way, and tactile. You are managing the entire thing, or a society is managing the entire thing through a very digital system of controls and coordination. And so a cyber attack can, in a very targeted way, can cause a massive amount of disruption and long-term impact on a society by targeting large infrastructure. And you have some other examples that you wanted to share as well. But this is something that the government, Homeland Security in particular, has been thinking about pretty specifically and has produced a lot of documentation around their thoughts on where the vulnerabilities are.
Just to kind of cycle back on this article that you and I were talking about, and of course we're going to put a link to that in the notes. But what's interesting is that we found this not because it was a cyber attack, but rather it was a suspected cyber attack. And I think that the questionability of whether a particular event is or is not a cyber attack, in some cases sometimes becomes subsidiary to the disruption that something like this might cause. So you're right. The description of these coordinated attacks is that it was attacking the hardware infrastructure, switching and all that sort of thing. But these are all, as you and I and our audience, I hope, all know, these are all both managed by devices and coordinated communications along a network, and are also continually generating data through sensors and IoT device, Internet of Things devices, and those types of componentry. So data is central to the transportation infrastructure, and yet we don't really think about the degree to which we are dependent on the streamlined operations of these infrastructures until something takes place. And so I'm going to refer back to an event that took place, I guess, about a month ago or so, maybe a little more recently, the CrowdStrike event that took place in the airline scenario, which was that there was a incorrectly pushed out update to some set of the software, and that caused some failures on some of the systems that were used by some subset of airlines that
You're underselling it, David. That thing was a cluster of epic proportions, and it wasn't just the airlines, but the airlines, surprisingly, we think of airlines as we take it for granted how airlines are going to travel relatively safely, as they do, as a percentage of,
almost surprisingly safely
but,
to
but
some
when you
extent.
when you see the impact that CrowdStrike update had on some airlines,
global transportation.
They literally came to a
Came
crashing halt.
Came to a crashing halt,
Maybe
right?
inelegantly put, but came to a halt.
And so
I don't think anything bad happened other than the halt. So which
no,
is good.
no, I mean, other than
nothing came
a
out
lot
of
of really angry people. But I was, as we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, I was in Boston at the time, and I don't live in Boston, and I wanted to get home. And when I wake up that morning and I'm looking at the news and I see, there's some kind of disruption at the airports due to some kind of event, and there they didn't even know what was going on. At that point they didn't know what was going on. My first inclination immediately is this is some kind of coordinated cyber attack that is intended to create disruption. And it turns out, interestingly, that it wasn't, but the effect was the same. And the interesting thing about it is that the impact was immediately felt. So it's not like somebody snuck in and stole some data. It was something happened and millions of people were affected right away. And so that's an interesting scenario, which is, if I'm going to do a cyber attack, is that what I'm going to do, is to try to do a major disruption all at one time? And that kind of goes back to the CNN article about the French trains, which is if you're going to be doing something disruptive, do you want to do something disruptive that everybody knows about, or do you want to do something disruptive that nobody knows about? And that kind of is the topic of where I want to go with this conversation today. Is not about cybersecurity per se, but rather about the cybersecurity question kind of exposes a deeper question, which is, or maybe two deeper questions. One is what are the best ways that a terrorist or some kind of actor, nefarious actor, wants to disrupt an environment or an ecosystem, and does it really matter whether if the disruption occurs because of some non-cyber event? Is it does it still make a noise, right? I mean, is it still just as bad? And so if we are focusing all our attention on cybersecurity per se as the solution to a data or an information risk, are we missing the boat on being able to be effective in combating those types of disruptions if they're not caused by a cyber event?
Well, and I think missing the boat is an appropriate term, because one of the docs we shared was around the cybersecurity risks for port facilities, and this was done by, I believe, Homeland Security. And there's a very nice looking infographic that breaks down what it considers to be 6 port components at risk: facility access, terminal headquarters data, terminal headquarters ransomware, operations technology systems, positioning, navigation, and timing, and the actually component systems within the vessels themselves. And interestingly enough, as we saw in Baltimore, right up the street from where you are, you turn the lights off on a very large ship going through a very difficult to navigate waterway for just a little bit of time, and one could potentially say, there was a power outage on a container ship in Baltimore Harbor. It lost power for a very brief period of time, but it lost power right as it was going through underneath a mission critical bridge and crashed into it and took the entire bridge down. And that bridge is no small problem, as not only does a lot of transportation go through there, but I believe that bridge was specifically reserved for hazardous waste and other kind of high-end environmental problem transportation rather than going through the Baltimore tunnel. And so
it's a bypass to the tunnel, and typically they don't want that kind of stuff inside.
They don't want that.
So I don't know that for sure, but I'm going to take your word on that. But for sure, you see, this is the thing: is like, as the more I know about how rickety some systems are in terms of control and access and the potential for cyber events. Like every time something happens, my immediate inclination is that's a cyber event. And
that was actually when I saw that boat accident in Baltimore, that was the first thought I had, is that was
right.
that was coordinated. That you turn the lights off on a ship right as it's trying to navigate underneath a bridge, and chaos ensues. But it's so brief that you can explain it away as it's just a failure.
That is what concerns me a little bit, which is this is what I'm talking about. Like the smart nefarious actor or terrorist or whatever noun you want to use for that. The smart one is going to do something that is so on the verge of subtlety and questionable source or provenance that you never know, that like you're willing. There's so many components that would make it probable that it could happen that
reasonable doubt.
Yeah, that you get to this point where you say, okay, well, it definitely could happen. And if if I'm a smart terrorist and I want to cause some damage to a critical infrastructure bridge in the middle of a relatively large city, and I could strap a bomb onto a car and drive it over the bridge and explode it. But that's really obvious. But if I happen to know that, large container ships sometimes do lose power for some reason, or maybe sometimes there's some kind of glitch, or I happen to notice that there is some type of event that could happen, that if it just happened to have happened at that point, that nobody's going to say for sure that's a cyber attack, that they're going to say there's enough reasonable doubt, as the term that you just used, that it definitely could have happened, and it definitely was an error or a mistake. But this is why I'm trying to steer our conversation in this way, to say it doesn't matter whether it is or is not, but more that we understand what the implications are of some kind of failure that is traceable to information or traceable to data, so that if it happens, we can anticipate what the problem is going to be, as opposed to trying to explain it away, at the end. And so, I've got another example here. I'm going to read from this article. This literally was also a week ago. Suspected. This is in InfoSecurity magazine, August 27th. Suspected cyber attack causes travel chaos at Seattle airport. The Port of Seattle has been hit by a suspected cyber attack. Again, suspected. Heavily disrupting airport and maritime services in the city ahead of Labor Day. The ongoing IT outage, which started on August 24th, has led to significant delays in the check-in process at the Seattle Tacoma International Airport, with no Wi-Fi currently available and display screens not working. Additionally, certain airport programs and services, such as Sea Visitor Pass and the Airport Lost and Found, are currently unavailable. Passengers are advised to get their mobile boarding pass and check baggage before they arrive at the airport to speed up the check-in process. The port said there are, quote, indications the outages have been caused by a cyber attack. So we have this event taking place at some particular location, and it's impacting Labor Day travel, and they are suspecting that there is some kind of cyber attack. But that's that whole thing. It's a suspected attack. I should probably do a little more research to see if they figured out what this was. What the issue is that, if you can't tell that it was a cyber attack, then you have no idea to be able to figure out, what's the best way to address it. And if somebody's really sophisticated in doing what they're doing, they will figure out how to be disruptive in a way that is even more insidious than causing, display screens to go blank. And I think that's where we have to get a better understanding of what some of the issues are. And let's see, I've got a couple of good quotes here as well, from a couple of the documents that we'll share. Number one, the cyber threat to the U.S. is varied and extensive, with possible impacts on local, regional, and national supply chains. So I think that's the bigger issue, is less about, okay, well, people can't get on their planes. I mean, that's bad, but when you're moving, multi-billion dollars worth of stuff from interconnecting freight networks, now you got big problems. right? And that's where I would go back to this beautiful graphic that the Homeland Security has put together to talk about the cybersecurity risks, and I would call them the cyber information risks or cognitive risks. Number one, facility access, and it says degradation or disruption of systems used to identify and direct cargo. Truck drivers and facility personnel can cause significant congestion, or the closure of the terminal until system restoration is complete. So I'm going to harken back to the early to mid days of COVID, where everything shut down, and what happened was there weren't enough people to be able to handle the existing traffic that was already in flight. When I say in flight, that's kind of a tongue in cheek, because both ships are not in flight, but the container ships contain a lot of materials, and being able to move a ship, get it into port, get the containers moved off the ship, figure out whose containers are what they contain, and then getting them connected to either trucks or getting them connected to rail is a complicated process. And now what you're looking at is 3 different freight infrastructure systems that need to interoperate, that are all dependent on both data and people. So in the COVID situation, you might have had the people, but you didn't. I'm sorry, you might have had the data, but you didn't have the people. But what would happen if all of a sudden there's a disruption in being able to determine who is allowed to get into the port to do work and who isn't, right? And again, it's easily attributable to some kind of software glitch. But if I want to create some kind of delay in moving materials, all I have to do is make sure that the people who are moving them or arranging for them to be moved can't get in, right? So that's
this is and I can only see where this is headed, right? So COVID was an interesting phenomenon in that it took humans out of the operations. And if I know one thing about where we're headed with AI, for instance, is the idea that we, or solution providers and ultimately facility management, will be very much wanting to try to reduce reliance on humans for any number of good reasons that they'll have. And as a result, I think AI's swan, the siren song of AI will be, you're not going to need as many humans. It's going to all be managed by these virtual neural networks that can, they never call in sick. They don't have to worry about pandemics, and they're always going to be there. However, in the case of a cyber attack, when those systems go down, there does need to be an analog, carbon-based fail-safe that knows how to move things around, that can actually come in and actually be the human backup to the system. And what does happen if we decide that, in order to minimize the facility access risk that we saw during COVID, we try to automate and create all kinds of machine learning and artificial intelligence solutions that reduce the humans down to a point where then when the systems go down, there really aren't any humans who know what to do left.
Well, that's one part of this problem, but I think there's a whole nother side of this, and I think we should wait until after the break to drill down into this. But for those of you who are conspiracy theory fans, let's drill down into a case study that the Homeland Security did, and we'll see that it's actually even more complicated and more potentially convoluted than that we already knew.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today.
All right, David, let's get into another example of where organizations, institutions, governments can become vulnerable to infrastructure and ultimately data and cybersecurity issues.
Yeah, and I kind of teased this before the break. It's particularly addressing those people who are craving anything to feed their conspiracy theory appetite. There's a case study in a document that was published by Homeland Security, and it talks about the case study is about again we were talking about port cybersecurity. So this is a company called Shanghai Zhenhua, and I apologize for the mispronunciation. Heavy Industries Company, or what they call ZPMC. It's a company that builds all sorts of global maritime infrastructure. So these are the physical things that help move stuff along at the port. So in particular, or what they refer to as physical cyber infrastructure. And, I'm going to read a little bit from this report. The company ZPMC, a subsidiary of the China Communications Construction Company, CCCC, is a primary contractor for Chinese leader Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative to develop infrastructure and trade links across Asia, Africa, and beyond. And Doug, I saw your ears perk up there. In 2020, U.S. authorities limited 5 CCCC subsidiaries access to U.S. technology. ZPMC was not on the list, citing its role in Beijing's military civil fusion program, among other factors. So currently, ZPMC equipment enjoys a 70% global market share, is utilized in over 100 countries, and makes nearly 80% of the cranes used at U.S. ports. And that's what's the interesting part here, is that national security and Pentagon officials were reportedly reviewing vulnerabilities linked to ship-to-shore cranes made by ZPMC. Among the concerns was the potential for remotely accessing and controlling the heavy-duty lifting equipment and likely disrupting U.S. logistical operations. Additionally, the cargo cranes are reportedly delivered to the U.S. fully assembled, operated through Chinese-made software, and purportedly, according to a recent report, sometimes managed by Chinese nationals on U.S. visas. So what we have here is a situation where 80% of the cranes used. So these cranes are, though, if you ever drive past a port and you glance over there are these big metal things that swing around and they connect to the container. So the ship pulls up right next to it, the port, and these cranes are used to lift these big containers off the ship and put them onto the port. So, all of those TV shows you see with people running around next to these huge containers at the ports, some crane was used to take those off a ship and put it on into that configuration. So there's piles and piles of these things on the ship, and then they are taken off the ship with these cranes. And the concern here is that the operation of these cranes is being done, that the cranes come fully assembled, that they're essentially fully encapsulated systems. So it's not like they get delivered as hardware and then you got to go install the operating system. It's all fully encapsulated, and they are being run by Chinese nationals who are on U.S. visas. So there's this concern, open source media reports. The Defense Intelligence Agency conducted a classified assessment and found that Beijing could potentially throttle port traffic or gather intelligence on military equipment being shipped, meaning that the people who are operating that these cranes could be embedded with the data collection capabilities to determine what is being shipped and what's in the containers and provide reports back to the Chinese intelligence agencies, as well as being able to have some guy there's a little dial that says 100%, they can ratchet that down to 98%, and that means it's running at 2% slower than it normally does, which means that those avocados that were being shipped from Mexico to New York or however they're being shipped suddenly are rotting in some container, as opposed to getting delivered to your nearest Whole Foods so that you can spend $2 on an avocado.
Well, I mean, David, I'm happy to wear the mantle of conspiracy theorist, but the idea that the Chinese wouldn't be doing that, or that the United States wouldn't be doing that if it were our cranes, is naive in the most generous sense. I mean, again, go back to the CrowdStrike example. I mean, how many people understood that if CrowdStrike just does some inelegant push of an update, it craters whatever it cratered, 80% of Microsoft's, operating system implementations around networks all globally. Did anybody see the level at which CrowdStrike installs itself down to whatever that was, the kernel? I mean, to the BIOS, wherever it got to. I mean, the idea that the Chinese couldn't throttle a crane remote control is ludicrous. I don't think that qualifies as a conspiracy theory because in the end, I think that's the whole point of the Belt and Road Initiative is basically, here's a bunch of free infrastructure to countries, not the United States, but to country. I mean, we're taking it because it's cheaper, which is one of our fatal flaws as a society. But the idea of most of the countries are taking it because they can't afford it, and the Chinese are all too happy to provide it with all the controls attached. I mean, nobody's giving this away. That's certainly not the Communist Chinese Party, which, I mean, the idea that there is not a indirect connection to any kind of large infrastructure provider in China producing this sort of thing is, again, naive. This is nation state activity, at a weaponized level when necessary.
I'm gonna defer to you in terms of the interpretation of this. While what I would do is I would just say, inside the same report, the next paragraph says, oh, interesting. It says that in 2021, FBI agents searching a cargo ship delivering ZPMC cranes to the Baltimore port and found intelligence gathering equipment on board. But the next paragraph says, the American Association of Port Authorities has repeatedly highlighted that despite the sensationalized claims that there is no evidence of the cranes being used to harm or track port operations, AAPA, that's the American Association of Port Authorities, also emphasizes that software undergoes rigorous security inspections with federal government partners. It is largely developed by companies in Japan and Sweden. The cranes
Same
do
with
not track.
CrowdStrike. It's like,
right,
again,
exactly.
It's like,
so
it all sounds great, and again, I think there's a lot of dancing happening here.
So
that
needs
to happen in order to not, create international incidents. But the notion that deep within the technology of this infrastructure, there are, toggles that can be flipped on and flipped off that can do whatever is needed to either gather data or
right. So that's where that's this fuzzy area. If we go back to the question about the container ship that crashed into the bridge and destroyed it, it's not been attributed to a cyber attack, but those of us who are prone to thinking that everything's a cyber attack immediately and continue to think that it was some kind of insidious cyber attack or some, and even if it's not, it's still some kind of information failure. But
or an incredibly successful test,
right?
where they wanted to see whether they could do it, and they got the bonanza of it actually, like, taking out the bridge to boot.
Right. So this is where we have to get a better understanding about what the threat is, and whether, even if it's not a cyber actor, it's the vulnerabilities in the infrastructure can pose some threat to the maritime infrastructure, IT and operating technology. So this and another reference quote that I have, and I have to determine which document I actually pulled it from, which is, this note about manifest. So what's a manifest? A manifest is a list of what's on, what's on the thing. So the plane manifest is the list of passengers on the plane, right? If you're in a, what do you call it? Not commercial freight air, but travel air, whatever you call that. But in cargo is the cargo manifest is the list of, the bananas and the grapefruit and the avocados that are inside each container, and what container they're in, and when it was put in there, and all the the data associated with what's inside that container, not necessarily how it moved around, but just what's inside. So here's another quote. First, there's concern about preserving the legitimacy of cargo manifests. Since cargo manifests are digitized, malicious actors can hack into systems and change information about the contents of cargo manifest to facilitate smuggling. This can allow the shipment of illicit goods with little detection. So, if you're Homeland Security, your main thought process is around like, okay, people bringing in bombs or smuggling or fentanyl or whatever it is, and that's different than disruption. And this is definitely important, which is you want to make sure that you're not smuggling things inside containers, these ship containers. So, the concern or the vulnerability is somebody can hack into the system and just modify the list of contents in the manifest so that instead of saying fentanyl, it says rubber balls, and now you think you've got a container full of rubber balls when in fact you're actually bringing in enough fentanyl to kill half the population of the United States. So that's the concern, or smuggling arms, or smuggling bombs, or whatever. So that's their concern. But I look at this and again, like because I am always tend to think about what's for dinner and what kind of gourmet food my wife and I can make, and what ingredients we're going to need. I think about the whole freight infrastructure of moving stuff around. And if I'm, some kind of global supermarket company, I want to know where the grapes are, where the pineapples are, where the bananas are, because, where the ice cream is. Because if somebody went in and said, okay, it's not ice cream, it's coffee mugs. So I don't have to be concerned about coffee mugs sitting in the port for an extra couple of days. But I probably do have to be concerned about the ice cream, because I'm going to have a big melted puddle of ice cream inside the container when I open it up. Somebody's going to get drowned in vanilla ice cream, right? Or, the components that I need for the latest, whatever Cabbage Patch Dolls trend is today. Those of us of a particular age will remember that. If I need the particular thread that's needed to be able to sew the hair onto a Cabbage Patch doll, and I got demand, going out the wazoo, and I can't satisfy that demand because I don't know where that thread is. That to me, that's a much more complex and insidious type of cyber activity or failure in the information chain, because I've got stuff and I have no idea where they are. And so that's just the contents of these things. But if you think about the way the rail system works, so this is also what's interesting is, like I said before, shipping, freight, rail, and trucking are three different environments, but they all have to interoperate because the container that was on that ship was taken off the ship, put into the port, and then either was put onto a rail bed or the bed of some kind of rail freight car or connector, or was loaded onto a truck, or maybe the truck drives to a rail depot and then it's taken off the truck and put onto a train, and then the train takes it 2,000 miles to another truck depot where the car comes off the train and gets put on a truck. Now these are containers are owned by somebody. But, if I were the owner of a container and I decided that I was only going to be the only one to move it, I better have a really big infrastructure to be able to move that. But if I'm smart, which all the owners of containers are, what they do is they make arrangements with all these different freight ecosystems to say, okay, I'm going to lend you the use of this car or the companies that are moving things. I'm gonna lend you the use of this container, and so each container has a unique identifier, and each container is got all this metadata associated with it, and the manifest is associated with the container. Oh yeah, passenger. Thank you, Ryan. The passenger air travel. That was what we were talking about before. The containers. There's all this information that needs to be shared, and I also need to keep track of where they are, because if I'm the owner, let's say I'm the Santa Fe Railroad or whatever railroad still exists, and I own a bunch of rail cars, and those rail cars are contain containers, and the containers are mine, but because I don't run my railroad into the Northeast United States, I'm going to lend that essentially or rent the use of that container to the operator of the trains that are pulling those cars, the engines that are pulling those cars to get it from New Orleans to Chattanooga or whatever, that's not part of my network. So I have to allow somebody else to put it on one of the trains that runs on those networks. And that's, it's not like there's one national rail system. It's lots of different companies that have merged over time. So keeping track of actually where these freight cars are or where these containers are, that in its own right is a complicated system. And if I were a hacker and I wanted to yet do another very subtle disruption, all I have to do is just go in and change the data associated, even with just a timestamp of, not even changing or erasing the rail car's unique identifier, but just changing the timestamps associated with when those containers pass some particular point. And so we've got, again, all this sensor, I think you and I even talked about this weeks ago or months ago, that these containers have barcodes on them, and so they're automatically scanned when they reach some locations. You got these scanners, these IoT devices that it establishes a timestamp for when the particular barcode was scanned at a particular point. Now all that data is just data, and it gets stored somewhere. So if I can hack into that, I can change that timestamp from saying September 3 to September 2. And now I think something showed up at a particular location, but it's actually not there. And so now, again, what am I going to attribute that to? Well, I could attribute it to a faulty device because, these devices can sometimes be faulty. And again, this is that part of this whole kind of insidiousness, which is there's a justification for saying that it wasn't a cyber event, when in fact it might have been a cyber event.
Yeah, I mean, this topic is maddening because it feels like the surface of vulnerability is just too vast to protect. I mean, this goes back to, I remember Stuxnet, which was a computer worm that attacked controllers within nuclear facilities and can cause cooling systems of nuclear facilities to shut down and create incredible havoc. And it was kind of a simple,
or maybe it's spinning
virus.
centrifuges at a different rate, so or slowing the centrifuges down. So.
Yeah, and that was, I want to say that was 2000, I don't know, probably 15 years ago, 2011, 2010, something like that. And again, it was incredibly nefarious and similar I think to the CrowdStrike situation, where all of a sudden you realize just how vulnerable you are by disrupting a very small element in a very large infrastructure, like cooling units or some other small little controller. And this is my larger point, which is, and maybe this is where we end up at the end here, David, when we get to our last segment, is where do we go from here? I mean, we've got obviously massive amounts of infrastructure of varying vintages being updated to more sophisticated computer-based technology-enabled infrastructures of sometimes questionable origin or potentially questionable control. It's to the point that we were making earlier. This is obviously on the frontal cortex of the Homeland Security Agency because they're investing in, legitimate infographics around it, talking about the various vulnerabilities within just a simple port environment. Let alone
such a nice infographic.
Yeah. They're taking it seriously when they get that kind of an infographic pulled together. So, or they want people to understand in no uncertain terms, right? So you're not going to read the whole thing. So we're going to make it easy for you to understand with this very nice, easily consumed infographic around all the vulnerabilities. But again, that's just a small part of a very large logistical transportation communication system that, when attacked, is going to lead to some seriously bad things for the people reliant on that system. So maybe we take a break here and we'll get into some conclusions and recommendations, and maybe a little bit more of a discussion around how to think about it.
Want more Insight Jam? Follow us on Instagram for exclusive content like a daily dose of best practices and buying advice from industry experts and leading solution providers. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel for long-form highlights from our expert panel discussions. The Solutions Review team is hard at work collecting the best enterprise technology information from around the globe, so don't miss out.
All right, David, last segment, let's talk a little bit about where we go from here, how we think about things going forward. Get me somewhat comfortable in my current agitated state.
Okay, so I think the problem, and I'm kind of using that term loosely, but the problem is that collectively as a community, we have defaulted to some concept of what cybersecurity means, and that we focus on our traditional perspectives of cybersecurity as either being, some kind of, again, we talked about this earlier, denial of service, or some kind of hack to steal data, or some kind of easily detectable and obvious disruption, like what happened with CrowdStrike. And so when things happen, we immediately say, okay, it was a cyber attack, when we may or may not have necessarily the evidence to demonstrate that. However, we also don't have enough evidence to necessarily say it wasn't that. And what that means to me is that what cybersecurity really means, and I wish we had a better term for it, because it's not what cybersecurity is and what people, like I do searches all the time on terms like that, and it's okay, well, protect your personal information and report things, and notify your people when there's been some kind of breach. And it's not just about that. It's really more about what are the types of impacts that unexpected or potentially spurious modifications to information can cause. And so it's not just the stealing of covert, or the covert stealing of intelligence about what arms are being shipped, but understanding that a slowing in the centrifuge is a impactful event that is attributable to some kind of data scenario or some kind of technical event that warrants attention that goes beyond just the exfiltration of sensitive data. So slowing down the way the cranes work, or changing manifests of cargo containers, or modifying the timing factors on the switching lights in a railroad network. The impact being the light wasn't working right, so the train went through the intersection and crashed with another train, and now there's been a derailing, and then there's cyanide is pouring out into the water area, and somebody's thinking, oh, this is really horrible that this event happened, without thinking that, actually the fact that we've published all the details about, what do they call them? The switches, or the control mechanisms are across the rail infrastructure have been published, and somebody can go and develop a whole map of it, and then can develop scenarios and simulations to look at all the different trains that are potentially running at one time, because you can also buy that data as well, and then be able to say, okay, well, if we were to do this at this particular time, it would appear as if it were a mistake, but it's something that we've caused. So I'm not specifically talking only about the rail infrastructure, but about any part of the infrastructure. For example, anything that might impact, being able to look at the safety inspections on bridges, something having to do with looking at the routine maintenance on airplanes. Something to look at is the emissions guidelines for how cars are being tested. I mean, there's all sorts of different places where data is being generated, collected, reported with just slight modifications that nobody will ever, immediately notice, that over time can cause, huge disruptions that nobody even knows about, and that it's not even attributable. So we have to have a different approach to understanding what the vulnerabilities are, and that they're not just about, planting a bomb on a plane.
Yeah, this is this might be the saving grace for me anyway, is that in order to coordinate a truly large horizontal attack requires a certain amount of communication that I got to believe is relatively thoroughly monitored by our government, and so and all governments. I'm sure that it would be nearly impossible to pull together a proper, large, coordinated conspiracy without it being picked up on through all the international surveillance that's happening. So we will probably end up with these individual incidences. And in the case of the first one we talked about in France, where it was, it was actually kind of rudimentary. We'll just set things on fire in a coordinated, very analog way. We're not going to use any sophisticated cybersecurity attack. We're just going to find the boxes and the cables that are exposed, and we're just going to set them on fire, and that will be enough to freeze the entire high-speed rail system in France.
And somebody had to know where those things were, and somebody had to know which ones were the right ones to pick. And all that is and that's data, and that data is out there.
Well, it's so right, and so there you go. So is that part of the recommendation as well? Is that we get, we do have this tug between, what is public data, what is confidential data, what is, top secret data. I mean, what do you think about this idea of controlling public data so that people don't know where, or at least unless they walk the rail lines, they'll never know where all. And maybe that's how they did it in France. I don't know. I mean, maybe they just walked the lines and figured it out. But
that's possible. But I mean, let's think about, we talked about this in one of our earlier episodes, and if we're able to do this, we should put a link to that earlier episode where we talked about de-anonymization, right? Which is that there's actually, sometimes we think the data is not perceivable, but by collecting a lot of open data, we're able to cobble together things that we're not supposed to know. So yeah, it's one thing to walk the rail lines and find where all the vulnerable points are, but it's very possible that there happens to be construction maps that are made available, because when you build railroads or where you lay down track, you have to file that with there's a public
your
plan
system in there.
It's all that stuff is like somewhere somebody filed a whole plan.
They'll have a community approval review of certain public projects,
and maybe that's done at different jurisdictional levels. So yeah, somebody in Montgomery County, Maryland, may be in charge of the bidding process for laying down track for the Purple Line in Montgomery County, and Prince George's County is monitoring that for the laying of the line for the track for the Purple Line in Prince George's County. And it didn't occur to either of them that was information that, when cobbled together, could provide the entire map of where all the vulnerable points are along the Purple Line from start to finish along the way. And then if I take that and then I keep ratcheting that up, and then it's not just the Purple Line, but it is the entire WMATA, Washington Metro area, transit authority, the surface transit, and the rail transit for the Metro. And then I ratchet that up another time, and I connect it to the railway system, the passenger railway system for commuter rail in the Washington area, and then the Baltimore area, and then the Pennsylvania, Philadelphia area, and the Wilmington, Delaware area. And I can get an entire map of how trains are moving around between any particular location. So if I want to blow up Penn Station in New York, I can slip a bomb into somebody's backpack on the Washington, D.C. Metro, knowing that that person is going to get out at Union Station and get onto an Amtrak, and then monitor that the entire way. These are the types of things where we don't understand the scope of the attack surface, because it is so distributed across different jurisdictions and across different agencies. And a lot of these agencies, even at the same level, at the federal level, are the bridge people and the energy people talking to each other? Are the energy people and the air traffic people talking to each other? mean, we don't know.
Well, I think it's fascinating. Actually, another little nugget of information that kind of floated across the field of view last week was that the OpenAI, I don't know what you'd call it. I guess it's a business, but it's also I think it was originally designed to be the artificial intelligence working group, for all of us. But now it's not. Now it's very much a private business, but they're at the forefront of creating the latest and greatest artificial intelligence frontier model. I think it's called Strawberry. It hasn't been released yet. It's going to be the ChatGPT 5, I guess is how you'd think about it, that would be coming. And what was interesting is that it hasn't been presented to anybody publicly, but in mid-July, Reuters reported that it was presented to the federal government. It was presented to officials within the national security organizations of the United States government. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about how serious a game this is, that we're now developing technology that will differentiate and, quite frankly, fortify nation states over and above other nation states based upon the ability to produce technology, leverage technology, and ultimately, I believe, implement technology that can have national security implications.
Yeah, I saw you crack open your box opener to open Pandora's box. This is a topic for a whole nother conversation. But I mean, it also, we can spin that around the other way, which is, what are the opportunities that we can use to take, these kind of AI systems, in their pristine state, to be able to have that, map out all the open data and then ask questions about the conglomeration of some of that data in terms of developing risk models that would inspire us to be a little more informed about where those risks are. So, I know you want to drill down into that whole vulnerability there, but even let's say that stuff is good and it can be used for good. How can we use that to inform us about the best way to understand the future of cyber risk and those types of things? So, like there's two sides to that coin, and I'm like, we should, yes, be concerned about the potential for security failures there, or for the potential for disruptive failure. But, maybe we can train these things to be so smart that they can put a leash on themselves.
Well, it's an arms race. You're always going to have bad actors. In my opinion, it's always easier to create chaos than it is to protect against the creation of chaos. I don't think there's any question about it. Building a house of cards takes a lot of patience and a lot of delicate behavior. Knocking a house of cards down takes no time at all. Maybe it's
it's also it doesn't. People aren't motivated to prevent things that haven't happened yet either. So it's also kind of a meme that we should consider, which is that nobody thought to have armed guards walking around the airport on September 9th, 2001, or September 10th.
Yep.
But after that, everybody, that's what you got. And now you've got this whole ecosystem also, the TSA, to protect against something that if it had been in place before the thing happened, everybody would say it's such a waste of time because nothing ever happens. So, this is a kind of a delicate tightrope to be walking on, but definitely something that we should continue this conversation about.
There will always be bad actors, and there will always be a good reason to create chaos for certain organizations, groups, whatever you want to call it. And in the end, I think we're always going to have to face down these things as they happen. I think bad things are going to continue to happen. I don't think there's really much you can do about that. But I think what you want to try to do is reduce the coordination of larger collections of bad things. You want to reduce it down to incidents rather than large, coordinated, global implications like we saw with the pandemic, actually. I mean, when something like a pandemic hit, I mean, it literally shut down the entire world and caused incredible disruption. And what you want to try to do is limit the digital version of that, I guess, from occurring. But when you see the CrowdStrike, the outfall of the CrowdStrike mistake, you begin to realize just how vulnerable we are, and hopefully, we can learn from these incidents and at least identify where the vulnerabilities are. And I think Homeland Security is certainly working well on that. And it gives us plenty of things to talk about.
I was going to say, let's add it to our list of things to talk about. And then I also want to remind people who are listening, if there's a particular topic that you want us to look into, contact us. You can contact us through you can add comments on the website. You can add comments to the YouTube channel, or just contact me directly through LinkedIn. Search for my name, David Loshin, and reach out. Say I heard you on the podcast, and we can have a little chat.
Yeah, and by all means, you can head to where we're building a collection of expert conversations, and that's at insidejam.com. And you can also find David there. All right, David. Well, once again, thanks for the time. Look forward to the next conversation. I'm sure it will be similarly interesting and provide me plenty of latitude to go off into my...
You feed your conspiracy monster.
Right.
All right.
Thanks.
Well, I'll go get some conspiracy food for you. So for next time.
All right, great. Thanks.